Greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode with Jewel Showalter. Jewel and Richard have been longtime friends, and I've known them through the work at Eastern Mennonite Missions. And Jewel, thank you for being on the program with us today. I invited Jewel, who's had a lifetime of global experiences, just to reflect on this past year, and also throughout her life, anything she wants to share about how she's seen the kingdom breaking through, how she's seen God at work in her life, in the church and the world. And so, Jewel, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Good to be with you, Conrad.
We talked a little bit as we got started just about the reaction when the pandemic hit, in terms of how folks were responding to the closing of the church and what you saw, what you encouraged. What you want to say more about that?
Yes. Well, during the first, just as we were all in shock and realizing we couldn't go to church like usual, and we're creatures of habit for good reason, I just felt led to contact our leadership team, our elders, and say, well, do you know that the church in Ethiopia, which is the largest Mennonite church in the world, during the Marxist government there was a period of just a little over a decade in the 80s, that the church had, and I had a special interest in this church because my parents took me as pioneer missionaries to Ethiopia in 1949, were some of the founders of this church. So I had a special interest in this international church body. There were about 5,000 believers in the church when the church was closed. I mean, people came and the buildings had been seized by the government, the doors locked, barred, illegal to go to church. But the church had sensed that this was coming, and so they had organized. In fact, my husband Richard and I had visited the church just several months before they were closed and confiscated, and they told us, we know exactly what to do. If the government closes our churches, we're all organized into cell groups, and we'll just go to those instead of going to the building. And so that's exactly what they did. And during the next decade, that church, and everyone was stunned by this, grew from 5,000 to 50,000 and spread from just about 2 or 3 provinces throughout the entire country. And so it was just a very wonderful story. And I shared this with our elders then. I said, well, I think we just ought to organize into cell groups. Why don't we do that? And let's experience body life on a deeper level. And so they did. So the congregation organized into connection groups, they called them. I'm actually leading one of those groups. And it was just a great time. You know, a lot of people, we had gone as spectators Sunday mornings, worshiping, wonderful worship team, lovely sermon, and go home. But I looked around and a lot of the people, I didn't even know their names. And people that ended up in my connection group, I didn't even know some of them. And we landed in the same group. And it just really feels like the kingdom, Conrad.
I was going to ask you, Jewel, what have you seen? How has that revitalized relationships or the church? What are you seeing come out of that?
Yeah, I can't speak more broadly because I've not actually been back to the congregation since then. I just did get my second shot, though, on Saturday, so I plan to be re-engaging again shortly. But I can just speak for our group that we're all saying, this means the world to us to have people to pray with. I live alone. And so I suddenly thought, God says he answers our prayers when 2 or 3 are gathered together, and I'm just one.
Yeah.
So I felt that need of, having prayer partners, having other people like that to fellowship with, that whole dimension of body life that often I wasn't experiencing in our Sunday morning congregation. And I am experiencing it now at a deeper level, and I really enjoy that. And I think many do, although I can't speak totally.
So are those groups continuing, Jewel?
Yes, they are. Okay. And I'm not sure. I know they're being evaluated by the leadership. And some of the groups, we took a break over the spike, even the small groups took a break over the spike over the holidays, but have resumed again. And while we're on the subject of house churches, Conrad, maybe I could just share a bit about the experience of some others that I've known. We were missionaries in Turkey from 1982 to 89. in that period of time, and no other option there than house churches. But the meaningful connections that we had, it was just some of the best and richest church times that I've ever experienced. And in fact, one of the members, a North American gal who had come from, I don't know, she had an eclectic spiritual background, a lot of different denominations, and she was part of our little Turkish house fellowship that included several foreigners and a variety of Turkish believers from Muslim background. And she said, wow, she said, this is the most meaningful church experience I have ever had in my entire life. And I was surprised to hear her say that, because our worship was certainly not professional.
Yeah.
And we basically opened the word together. I remember going through Romans with new believers for the first time. It was just incredibly exciting. And so we all just enjoyed that. And then another experience, our daughter and her husband have worked in China for 21 years. And they got stranded here because of the pandemic and some political issues. And I was asking her, and they've only had a house church experiences for 21 years. And so I asked her, what do you think the church in America should be doing during this time? And she said, well, I really think the leaders, instead of trying to get everybody to come back to the building, should be equipping families to have their own family worship times, to learn how to pray and dwell in the word together in deeper ways than they ever have before. And I thought, wow, that's right on. Because pastors are supposed to equip the saints for the work of ministry. So why not in the home context? Why don't we look at this as a time to resource our parents in how to lead family worship and family prayers and set up that, instead of our focus just trying to shoo everybody back into the big building.
So Jewel, why is this message hard for folks to hear? Because I just find resistance to this message that you're sharing. And, you know, when I interviewed Yamaru, it was the same kind of thing. And Caleb K. and, you know, Cesar Garcia had similar kinds of things to say about the pandemic and the richness of this time. I keep saying this is the richest time the church has had in my lifetime in this country to do things differently. What is it that keeps us from, what holds us back, Jewel? You've had this global experience, you've looked at the world and church through for 70 years. What prevents us or gets in the way of our hearing the kind of message you're sharing?
I've pondered that too, Conrad, and you know, all the excitement that's around mega churches and all the resources that they have for children and youth and all this kind of stuff that you don't have in a house church. I wonder if it's a time of pruning and clearing out a lot of dead wood, people that are coming just for the loaves and fishes. I wonder if it's that. I have been concerned about the level of nominalism in the church. And if it's the nominal people that aren't interested in this depth of seeking first the kingdom, hungering and thirsting after righteousness, if those are the people that are getting pruned out, I'm guessing it's going to create more fruit. I don't know. But that's just one reflection that I've had. Maybe that's too harsh.
Well, I think it's the same question I have had, to resistance I have felt to thinking of this time as something the Spirit is up to doing. Jewel, as you think about where the church goes next coming out of this, do you have any reflections on what God is up to and the way God is? And if there's a pruning that's taking place, where does that leave the American church or the global church, or what are your thoughts about that?
No, but now that I'm working here at Rosedale Bible College, I have wondered, you know, we struggle for, you know, our enrollment each year. We just would like more students. And it seems that somehow people are more interested in, you know, a respectable career and how much money they can make and that kind of thing, rather than really hungering and thirsting after righteousness. And so I've just pondered, you know, what would it take? You know, this place should be packed to the gills if we're really seeking after God and wanting that to be first in our lives? Wouldn't we be wanting to know his word? Wouldn't we be wanting to hear his spirit and moving and seeking first his kingdom? And so I don't know. I don't know, Conrad. I guess I don't have anything too profound to say about
Well,
that.
you know, I did some study. I did a study for Rosedale, and I agree. I mean, I said the same thing, that I think this place should be full because it offers so much of what you just described.
And when did our heroes become, movie and sports stars instead of missionaries and saints and martyrs who've gone before and laid down their lives for the cause of Christ? But suddenly now we're following whoever,
Yeah, I had this. In fact, I'm sure you and Richard came through at one time when I was a kid to Locust Grove in Belleville. And, Sunday evenings were often missionary stories. And I love those stories. And I thought last week after meeting with Cesar Garcia and Yemuner Talahun, that's kind of what this has been for me, is kind of hearing those missionary stories again. And I've left every one of them just excited because there's something that God is up to that I need to be part of, that I need to hear about. And so I agree with you. I think it's re-identifying all that's important in the kingdom, all that's what the kingdom is about. Jewel, one of the things I also keep pressing our congregation on is that I think that it all begins with our own personal life with God. And I've heard a number of folks say for them, COVID has been a really important time to go deeper in their life with God, to rediscover the disciplines. Can you say anything more about that, one's life with God and the broader impact on the church? Because I think for me, there's a connection between how, I think for 10 years, my primary message to the congregation has been, if you don't develop a life with God, trouble will come and you will not have a foundation there. So I know you're one who's developed a life with God. Can you talk about the richness, the value, the importance of one's life with God when we face difficulties, even like this last year?
Yeah, well, it's obvious that's one of the foundational principles of Christian faith. You can't build a Christian life if you don't have a foundation, and that life with God is very, very foundational. I think I was in college, maybe, when I made a decision that I was going to read the Bible through every year, even the boring Leviticus parts. And I've done that. It was just kind of one of those spiritual disciplines that I really wanted to know the Word of God in depth. And I also wanted to learn to hear from God, that God speaks to those who are intimately connected with him. And so I've also had a practice, not every day, but of listening prayer, pouring out my thoughts. These are my thoughts, God. This is what I think ought to happen. And then listening, okay, but God, your thoughts are higher than mine. What are your thoughts about this particular situation or decision? That kind of thing. And so, that's really sustained me. So I try to read broadly in the scriptures. I also hone in. I read the Psalms probably twice every year. I just recently, about a year ago, started following a Lectio series online. It's like a 15-minute kind of waiting before the Lord with scripture and reflection, and really enjoy that. So that's what I've been doing, and then sharing with other people, like in my connections group at church as well. And I wanted to share one story I forgot from that connections group, but one of the gals would have come to Christ through the church, sort of like a first-generation Christian, and she said she had just never prayed in public before, and she was terrified when the pastor would sometimes call people in the congregation to stand up and form prayer circles and pray for each other, and she was just frozen and tongue-tied and so on. But then she participated in that. She gradually started to learn how to pray, and she would haltingly sometimes pray in public. She works as the assistant to the warden of one of our local prisons here in this community. And during the COVID situation during this past year, prisons have just been, hotbeds for infection, and the staff and everybody was terrified of super spreading throughout the prison and what that would mean. And so her warden, who knew she was a Christian, said, would you be able to, she said, our staff are just so upset. Would you be able to just pray for our whole staff before we go out to our duties for the day, the guards and everyone, the cooks, and just pray for the whole staff. And so, dear terrified lady who never very much prayed before, she has every morning of for this past year that she's been at work prayed for the entire prison staff. And it's just been amazing. But that kind of growth in people, when they are called to go deeper and to actually step out, Conrad, and minister, because we all know that the teacher and the preacher learn more than the person in the pew.
That's right.
And so how can we get people to step up? And that's what I was also going to say about our students here at Rosedale during the pandemic here. We've created this bubble on campus where all 70 students are inside this bubble. And we test them, they're all negative. And then we have our sanctuary here on campus, our little monastery, I sometimes call it. And so these students, of course, used to leave campus to go to, visit churches around in the neighborhood. And now they're not allowed to because they're confined to campus. And so these young people are stepping up to the plate, preaching to their peers and leading the most marvelous worship times. I've sat in the back for a lot of that time. And I just love it.
So
that
Jewel,
you are formed as you perform, perhaps in a leadership role, as you're forced to. It's very uncomfortable, but as you step up and do it, you are trained. And so I've been grateful for the way that I've been pushed in my life to do things I didn't think I was capable of doing. And then by doing it, you learn, by God's grace, I can. There's the word,
Absolutely.
There's the anointing for that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jewel. That's powerful. How do you anticipate the students might be different coming out of this experience of being in this bubble together versus a regular semester? I mean, it's going to have an impact on them.
Oh, definitely. And many of them have testified that it's been the most profound experience of their lives. And I've used the word monastery different times. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with Rod Dreher's book on the Benedict option. And I've wondered if, the monastic model is one that we need to draw from, even in this era, where your focus really is single-heartedly on God.
Yeah, Jewel, I've thought about that too. I was having my quiet time a month ago or so, and I just thought that just came to me. I was thinking of Bonhoeffer's Confessing Church model and the little group that he gathered. And I wonder too if there's a time and place for that, I think. And it sounds like Rosedale's capturing some of that. I'm thinking about the report that I wrote for them, and I'm thinking about the mission vision statement they had and how what they desired and prayed for is coming to pass probably in ways they would never have anticipated through a pandemic. I mean, you're talking about community and discipleship and learning together, being a community of faith together. Sounds like what you've developed there is bringing that together in ways that wouldn't be possible otherwise.
Another thing they've done is, we were talking about small groups earlier. They've divided the whole student body into discipleship groups. I think about maybe 6 or 7, and those are led by faculty and staff mentors. So I had a group that just met in my home this morning, and just beautiful experiences of body life too, then that include us as faculty and staff as well. So
that's neat. Jewel, in the fall, I'm actually going to begin a podcast on aging and aging and spirituality and faith and finding meaning in life. And so while we're on this, you talked about 70 years of this global experience. How has a life with God for you over time impacted the way you experience something like this year, or has impacted the way you experience difficulty or challenges or trouble? This a longer season out of which you're living than when you were maybe 25 or 30 or 40. How has aging impacted your experience of God and your experience of the kingdom?
Well, you have more experiences to look back on and remember. when God was faithful in the past. Probably the most difficult season for me was in my 20s, probably 25, as you said, right after my third child was born and my husband, Richard, was diagnosed with cancer for the first time.
Yeah.
And it was then that I had a really serious faith crisis. And I thought I was being such a good little girl, going to be a missionary, going to be a pastor's wife, you know, that God shouldn't let this kind of thing happen to me. And during that experience, God just told me in a very profound way that I needed to trust him. He told me that 3 times. And as I argued back and forth with him, and he just, he said, Jewel, you have to trust me. And I realized it's either trusting him or there's nothing. Black hole or God. And I chose God. And so that foundation of faith, which should have developed earlier, but did not develop until there was a crisis, that really shook my young faith and tested it. And then I just feel like everything we experienced in our life since then was really built on that firm foundation of trust. And the second thing I would say would be the concept, and this probably struck me more as a missionary kid and then as a missionary mom and itinerant resource person around the world, the need to just dwell in God, because you do not know where your earthly dwelling will be. And so as you are dwelling in God, you become content to dwell anywhere. Like Paul says, the Apostle Paul, how to live in plenty or in want, it doesn't matter. How to be rich or poor, it doesn't matter, because you're dwelling in God. And there's the security and richness of that experience that enables you to live anywhere.
Jewel, in the podcast, I've noted again and again, it's out of those times of darkness and suffering that we have the potential to finally have this moment of faith and this development of a life with God that we don't, at no other time in our life are we as potentially open to God as in those moments. And I think that's been part of my grief around this whole pandemic, is when I hear an unwillingness to sit with God in the midst of whatever we're experiencing, and kind of an impatience to move out of it because it's uncomfortable. When you're speaking my language and saying it's in those moments of crisis that we meet God. And so I think
it
again,
really is.
Yeah.
I've often wished, Conrad, just like Jesus wished he could skip the cross, you've often wished, and you certainly don't wish those experiences on anyone. But yeah, that's very true. Very true.
Well, Jewel, I think it was my failure here technologically, because I went into the Facebook group and I think people aren't getting through. So I apologize to you for that, but this will go up right away and people will get to see it.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank you for a delightful conversation. You are one of the saints, and you're looking for a city that's not made with human hands, and made by God our Maker. So thank you for sharing your journey with us. Is there anything else you want to share before we conclude, or thoughts you have?
I think what I said about money, and I was talking to one of our donors the other day, and he just laughed. He said, Jewel, I couldn't believe it when I heard that you were going to be the director of development. He said, that is just the funniest thing I ever heard. He said, of all the people in the world that I know, he said, you're probably one of the ones who cares the least about money. And I was kind of stunned by his reaction. And then I thought, you know what? I care about the kingdom, and the kingdom involves money, and the kingdom involves commitment.
Yeah.
And so I care about people committing their lives, their resources. It's a whole life, a full-orbed stewardship. And so that's why working as a director of development can make sense for me.
I think about when you share that
My
the story of
friend
George Mueller, who had the orphanage, and just how his focus was not on the money, but the money always showed up. And it's
Yeah.
that kingdom thing again. You know, when we're seeking first the kingdom,
Seek
vision
first,
is the
and that
kingdom's. Sorry.
that has been my life verse, Conrad. If you would ask me to choose a life verse, I would say, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you.
Amen.
And it's just, but it's human nature to get the cart before the horse. And so we always do it. And so I think that's what renewal, revival is. It's getting the cart and the horse in the right perspective, because naturally we always drift back. And even though Anabaptism, we're part of the Anabaptist family, it began as a renewal movement.
Yes,
we're trying to have people, get the cart and the horse in the right perspective. But again, we just drift back. And that's what we started out talking about, this nominalism in the church.
Yeah.
And so there has to probably be a renewal movement.
Yeah, I have a good friend who's a sociologist who talks about the rubber band. We can stretch for a while and make some changes, but then we so readily stretch back to where we were. And I think that's true for the church. And so we've got to continually, I love a prayer by Peter Marshall. He says, "Thank you for these difficult things that just keep me close to you." It's the difficult times that keep us close to God. So some of us seem to need more of those than others, Jewel, and he's faithful and he's good. Thank you so much for being part of
You
us.
had your share.
Well, he's been faithful all along the way. He's so good. So thank you, Jewel, for sharing this. God's blessing to you.
You too. Thank you.
Blessings.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.